It was the end of October, and a young boy named Sean was in hospital. He should have been picking out a Halloween costume and enjoying himself with his friends, but instead, he was stuck in a hospital, waiting to have his tonsils removed. His parents spoke to the receptionist, and a nurse led them down the hallway to the room where Sean was going to be staying. The lime green walls were all decorated with orange and black streamers, white skulls, and paper cutout pumpkin heads. When they reached the hospital room, they heard a big commotion. There was a boy lying in one of the beds and he was screaming, "I'm not Martin! I'm not Martin!" Two other nurses were trying to calm him down. One held a big syringe and the other prepared his arm to give him an injection. They pulled the curtains around his bed. The screaming gradually stopped, and when the nurses opened the curtains again, the boy was lying unconscious in his bed. Sean was curious and asked the nurse what was wrong with the boy.
"He's having his left leg amputated in the morning," she said. "The poor boy is so nervous about it that he is trying to convince us that he's not himself. He thinks if he says he's not Martin, he won't have to have the operation."
"Are you sure you have the right person?" Sean asked.
"Of course," replied the nurse. "His name's Martin. It's right there on his chart."
Sean's parents left, and he sat on the edge of his bed reading a book. Another nurse came around with a trolley to serve dinner, but he could only stoach a few mouthfuls. The hospital food was disgusting. He lay on the bed for a while, staring at the ceiling. He was bored out of his mind. Just then, he noticed that Martin was waking up. "Hey, Martin," he said. "My name's Sean. I'm your new roommate." "I am not Martin," the boy groaned as he rubbed his head. Sean tried to have a conversation with him, but the boy was irritated and didn't want to talk. He just sat there, silently brooding. At 10 o'clock, a nurse came in and told them it was time to go to sleep. She said goodnight to them and turned off the lights. Just before the lights went out, Sean noticed the other boy staring at him with an odd look on his face. He soon dozed off, but his sleep was haunted by strange dreams. When Sean woke up the next morning, there were two doctors leaning over his bed. "Let's go, Martin," said one of them. "It's time for your surgery." Sean was confused. "What?" "But I'm not Martin," he replied. "The nurses warned us about you," the other doctor replied. "They told us you'd say that." "You're making a big mistake," Sean insisted. "I'm telling you I'm not Martin." One doctor reached out and checked the medical chart at the end of his bed. "Of course you are," he replied. "It says so right here on your chart." "That's not right," Sean screamed. "Somebody must have switched them." He started to struggle, but the doctors held him down and put him in a straitjacket. As they placed him in a wheelchair and took him away, Sean was still screaming, "I'm not Martin! I'm not Martin!" The last thing he saw as they wheeled him out the door was the smiling face of the real Martin. When I was 12 years old, I had a best friend named Brenda. After school, we always went to her house to hang out. She lived in a big house on the edge of town. One day, Brenda didn't show up for school. She was absent for the next few days, and I began wondering if there was something wrong with her. After she had missed a whole week of school, I decided to pay her a visit. I cycled all the way across town and arrived at her house just as it was getting dark outside. When I rang the doorbell, I got a shock when the door opened almost immediately. Brenda's mother was standing in the doorway, but there was something strange about her. Her eyes seemed darker than usual, and her hair was hanging loose around her shoulders. I noticed that she was wearing a bathrobe. The most unsettling thing was the way she was grinning at me. She didn't say a word. She just stood there staring at me with an evil smile playing across her lips. "Is Brenda here?" I asked nervously. She beckoned at me to come in, and before I could say anything, she had slipped back into the darkened house. As I stepped inside, my eyes strained to see in the darkness, but I wasn't sure where she had gone. Just then, I heard a strange humming sound and followed it into the kitchen. I found her there, standing at the kitchen sink with her back towards me. The moment I entered the kitchen, she stopped humming, and there was an eerie silence. I took a seat at the kitchen table and waited. She seemed to be taking forever. I spent the next 5 minutes just sitting there, wondering what was going on. Then I realized something very odd. The whole time I had been sitting there, she hadn't moved a muscle. Her back was still towards me and I couldn't see her face. Her hands hung limp by her sides and her head was tilted slightly. Something was very wrong. I stood up nervously and approached her. She remained completely still. Ever so slowly, I moved around her and tried to get a look at her face to see if she was all right. The sight still haunts me to this very day. Her eyes were wide open and she still had that evil grin on her face. I was so freaked out that I couldn't bear to stay in the kitchen a moment longer. Without saying a word, I backed out of the room and made my way towards the front door. I jumped on my bike and began cycling as fast as I could down the long, winding driveway and all the way across town. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of my house. It wasn't until a few days later that I found out why my friend Brenda had been absent from school. My parents told me that there had been a tragic death in Brenda's family. "What?" I asked. "Who died?" My parents broke the sad news to me, and it made my hair stand on end, and I was crying from fright. Brenda's mother had died suddenly, and the night I called over to her house, Brenda had been at her grandparents' place, attending the funeral. Years later, when I was 16 years old, I made a little extra money by working as a babysitter on weekends. One evening, a friend of mine called me and said she knew a family who desperately needed a babysitter. She was busy and wanted to know if I was interested in babysitting for them instead. She told me the parents were very nice, the pay was good, and their 3-year-old daughter was polite and well-behaved. I wasn't doing anything important, so I told her I would be glad to take the job. That evening, I went to the family's house and met the mother. Her name was Ruth, and she was getting ready to go out for the night with friends. She mentioned that her husband was out of town on business and gave me some numbers to call if I needed to get in touch with her. The night went very easily. I made dinner for the little girl, gave her a bubble bath, then got her dressed for bed. I was around midnight when I heard the front door open and footsteps coming down the hallway. I thought it was strange, because I hadn't even heard a car pull up. Turning around, I was relieved to see Ruth making her way into the living room where I was sitting watching TV. She never said a word to me, and as she walked past me, I was surprised by how different she looked. Something about her eyes had changed, and she was grinning from ear to ear. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I knew that evil grin. I had seen it before, many years ago. Ruth sat at the dining table with her back turned towards me. Her hands hung limp by her sides. Her head was cocked to the left. She was humming to herself. "Ruth?" I asked nervously. "Ruth, are you all right?" No answer. "Ruth, you're not alive anymore, are you?" Silence. With shaking hands, I quickly gathered my things and backed out of the room. When I got to the hallway, I opened the front door and looked outside. There was no car in the driveway. All of a sudden, the eerie silence was broken by the sound of the phone ringing. I didn't want to answer it. I was afraid of what I might hear. For a moment, my hand seemed to hover over the phone. Then I lifted the receiver and put it to my ear. I already knew who it was. It was the police, calling to tell me that Ruth had been involved in a car accident an hour ago. She had been killed on impact. Tears were streaming down my face as I ran upstairs, grabbed Ruth's daughter from her bed, and bundled her up in her blanket. As came back downstairs, I had to pass by the door to the living room. I could still see Ruth sitting at the table with her back to me. Without pausing for a second, I ran out into the night, carrying the little girl in my arms. A family was camping and left their tent to go on a day hike. They were a few hours from their campsite when a storm suddenly blew up. They became disoriented in the wind and driving rain. They tried to trace their steps back to the campsite but became lost in the unfamiliar backcountry. Being experienced hikers, they knew once they were lost it was best to stay in one place than wander in the woods, so they prepared to settle down and wait for rescue. Darkness fell, and the family built a fire to keep warm. As they snuggled up against each other and started to drift off to sleep, they heard a noise coming from the trees. "Who's there?" one of the parents called, but there was no answer. Then they heard the sound again, but once more when they called out, there was no answer. "Perhaps it's someone who can't speak," suggested the daughter. So her mom called out, "Is there anyone there? Clap once for yes and twice for no." There was one clap.
"You were right," the parents said to their daughter. "There is someone out there."
"Are you here to rescue us?" shouted the mom. Clap, clap.
"Are you lost like us?"
Clap, clap.
"Do you live out here in the woods?"
Clap, clap.
"Let me try,"
said the son.
"Are you a boy?"
Clap, clap. "Are you a girl?" Clap, clap. They all looked at each other, puzzled. Thinking he was being funny, the son asked, "Are you human?" Clap, clap. Now the family was scared. "Are you alone?" called the mom. Clap, clap. The family huddled together more. "How many of you are there then?" Clap, 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 clap.
There was a young boy named Kenneth who lived with his parents. When his father got a new job in the city, the family moved into the top-floor apartment of an old residential building. Every evening, when Kenneth came home from school, he had to take a long elevator ride to the 25th floor. After a few days, he began to get a horrible feeling whenever he stepped into the elevator. He couldn't quite explain why, but for some reason, he had the distinct impression that he was being watched. He also thought he could hear strange whispers and mutterings as the elevator ascended to the top floor. One evening, when he arrived home from school, he saw some other boys who lived in the same building. They were a few years older than him, and he noticed that they avoided the elevator altogether. He caught up with them as they walked up the stairs. When he asked the boys why they weren't taking the elevator, they told him about some rumors that had been circulating among the kids who lived in the building. Apparently, all of the other children who lived there thought that the elevator was haunted. They said they heard disturbing shrieks and moans coming from the elevator shaft. They also told him about a kid who had gone missing in the residential building only a few months before he and his parents moved in. Kenneth had a sinking feeling in his stomach as he listened to the story the older boys told him. They said the kid had mysteriously disappeared and nobody was able to find him. He was still listed as a missing person. The adults thought he must have been kidnapped and the police were still investigating, but the kids suspected that it had something to do with the old elevator. That was why they avoided using it whenever possible. When Kenneth reached the top of the stairs, he ran into his apartment and breathlessly told his mother about the unsettling stories the older boys had shared with him. She just laughed and dismissed them as the typical rumors and legends that kids and teenagers always like to use to scare each other. His mother said that there was no such thing as a haunted elevator, and it was childish to believe such outlandish tales. Still, Kenneth couldn't help being terrified of the old elevator. He took to using the stairs as much as possible, even though it was a very long climb, and it left him tired and out of breath. The only time he would use the elevator was when his mother or father were with him. He figured that nothing would happen to him as long as one of his parents was there to protect him. One evening, Kenneth came home late after football practice. He was deathly tired and was really dreading having to climb the stairs. He walked into the lobby of the residential building and breathed a sigh of relief when he saw his mother standing there with her back to him waiting for the elevator. The doors opened and she stepped inside. Kenneth jumped in after her. The elevator doors closed, and that's when he realized that the light wasn't working. They were in complete darkness. Kenneth broke out into a cold sweat. They started to go up. In the darkness, the frightened boy heard an eerie chuckling sound. "Mom, did you hear that?" he asked nervously. As the elevator ascended, the chuckling grew louder. It sounded like evil laughter. "That's the sound I told you about, Mom," he said, shaking with fear. A chill ran down his spine when he heard a deep voice reply, "You really believed I was your mother?" A girl was sitting on the subway late one night, and she noticed that the woman sitting across from her was staring intently at her. The woman was sitting between two old men. The girl kept looking away, but the woman wouldn't break eye contact with her. The stare was beginning to freak the girl out. At the next stop, a new passenger got on. It was a tall man in a gray trench coat. He sat down next to the girl. The woman paid no attention to the man in the trench coat. She just kept staring at the girl, who was getting more and more creeped out as time went on. The two old men didn't even glance in her direction. She pretended not to notice, but each time she glanced at the strange woman, the stare continued. When the train was pulling into the next stop, the man in the trench coat got up to leave. Suddenly, he grabbed the girl's arm tightly, and as the doors opened, he dragged her off the train. The subway doors shut, and the train pulled off, leaving the girl alone on the platform with the man in the trench coat. She started screaming for help. "Calm down," said the man. "I just saved your life. I didn't mean to scare you, but I had to get you off that train. The woman sitting opposite you was dead, and the two men beside her were propping her up.